Cool. All right, and we're live. So welcome everybody to the May MacAdmin meetup. We're joined today by Russell Hancox from the Santa team at Google, which is super exciting. Lots to talk about there. We'll give everyone a few minutes to stream in here. As always, like if anyone has any questions or topics, feel free to drop them in the chat in Slack, and I'll keep an eye on that. Also wanted to take a minute as far as news over the last month to talk about, we lost a sort of a giant in the community with Charles Edge. Does anyone here work with him closely? I never had the privilege to.
I mean, I met him at many conferences, and frankly, he was one of the first persons I get to talk at MacSysAdmin while I was a shy attendee, and so he was very open and welcoming. And since then, I met him almost every year at least, and at other conferences. So yeah, very sad.
Yeah. Hey, Eric.
Hey, I've been backstage, but thanks for mentioning Charles. Henry, I didn't want to interrupt.
I mean, I met you the same time, so yeah.
Charles always took care of his audience. Charles always took care of the people he was serving in the community. And my first interaction with Charles was after I did a presentation. He had some concerns about the information that I was sharing with my audience. And it wasn't about whether my information was right or wrong. It was about what the audience would do with that information. And it was really great to see the care that he took for the community and what people would do with that information. And you know, his research into the history of computing was a fantastic. You know, just great that he would gather that information in those interviews and share that with the community. And the latest edition of the MacAdmins podcast was with W. Andrew Robinson, and that's the last episode that they recorded with Charles, and it's I'm getting emotional thinking about it. He gave so much to the community, and again, thanks for bringing that up and giving us a chance to give him some tribute.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the MacAdmin podcast is fantastic. Definitely shout out to that resource. Listened to that many times. And yeah, I hadn't seen the history of computing until I was reading about Charles, and yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, it's really interesting when you think about like how we spend so much time innovating and like working with the technology we have now, and the work of archiving and going back and like chronicling how we got to where we are now is like such important work too. And for those of us who haven't been here since the beginning, it's great context.
Well, and it's kind of cool. You can see a lot of the same patterns over the past decades. Some of the same things that we were concerned about 20 years ago and thought were, you know, those problems are solved and we'll never run into them again. We're seeing them again, just like identity and authentication, like that, passcodes and platform SSO, like all that stuff is coming around again.
Yeah, new faces, same problems.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I think I want to give Russell a chance to introduce himself a bit. Just pass the mic.
Thank you for having me. So I've been a MacAdmin for 11-ish years at Google. My entire MacAdmin career has been at Google, which is an interesting place to start. So I was a field tech at Google before moving over to New York. So I did help desk support basically. But field techs is an interesting role because you you do a lot of support for different platforms, and it was fun serving people like Vint Cerf and having to fix his phone for him, and having various engineers who are much smarter than I am coming to ask for help with filers and things. But I did a lot of work with the MacOps team when I was a Philtech, because I had previously worked as a genius at Apple during college. And then I came over for a visit to visit them, and at the end of the week I was invited to join the team and move over to New York. At that point in time, I think Google had around 30 to 40,000 Macs, which was considered enormous at the time. It's not anymore. I think we probably have about 100,000 more than that at this point. But I am not on the team, so I couldn't tell you the exact numbers. We were having a bit of a brief chat before we started about how Santa got started. And I like telling this story because it's fun, but an ex-co-worker from that team, Harold, who had left MacOps just before I joined, we were having lunch in Zurich one day while we were visiting his office. We were having a conversation about binary allow listing systems for macOS. There weren't many, and we were evaluating one of them at the time, and we didn't think it would work very well for us with the number of machines that we had. And he jokingly said over lunch, well, how hard could it be to write one? And that's usually famous last words. And I was like, yeah, don't be silly. I can't do that. But as soon as I got back to New York, Monday morning, I sat at my desk going, can't really be that hard. Let's see how this could work. And Ed Marzak and I both wrote proof of concept. I think mine got further. Ed's got there quicker and mine got further. So mine ended up going all the way in the end.
Amazing.
And then a lot of that history behind that I've forgotten at this point. It's so long ago. I know we released the project publicly sometime towards the end of 2014, but that was after we'd already gotten it onto every Google machine and into lockdown.
Wow.
I had just enough foresight to know that releasing it publicly without proving that it works really well would be a bad move. We thought if we can get it running on every Google machine, it's probably good enough for the rest of the world.
Amazing. Yeah, that's, speaking of history of computing, that's always fun to look back at your own projects and how they've evolved.
Yeah.
So what was your experience with, open source software and, writing MacAdmin tools prior to this?
Sorry, I lost you for a second. I missed most of that question.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everything's come back.
Cool. I was just curious what your experience with, open source software and developing MacAdmin tools was prior to getting nerd sniped into writing the allow listing utilities.
I had never open sourced anything that anyone had ever seen. And I had only written things in Python, some basic tools, mostly internally. I think the only thing I had written before that point, which we never open sourced, was a tool to wipe and reinstall an image onto a machine from a netboot master.
Interesting.
We used to do that where we would netboot into an image and use that to install another image. And we had a tool that did it in Python, and that stopped working because Apple took Python out of the netboot image. So I wrote a new version in Objective-C. I think that was the first thing I wrote before Santa.
And then, of course, netbooting in general.
Yeah. That tool ended up getting rewritten to work locally, so you could hook up one Mac to another and use target disk mode, which I think we may have open sourced.
I think, yeah, I don't recall the name, but we could look it up on GitHub.
It was Restore.
Yeah, Restore.
And CanHasImage was the Python version we used before that. Yeah.
And so I'm curious about that evolution of, building a tool, deploying it to every Mac under management, open sourcing it, from there, like how did this grow? Did you sort of find yourself having to scale up a team and?
Surprisingly, no. When we announced the project we didn't really announce it. It was pushed to GitHub, and we didn't really do very much to publicize it. It's kind of like, here it is. I think a few of us mentioned it on Twitter, and that was enough to get the ball rolling. We got quite a lot of stars pretty quickly. There was a few articles in the news, like the Register picked it up. Because Google was involved, they were like, oh, this is a big deal. I was like, it's not. It's just me. It's really not that big a deal. And we didn't have very many public contributions. One of the few people externally who contributed was Tom Bergin, who I think worked at NIH at the time, and eventually came to Google. And then Tom and I had worked together on Santa ever since.
Oh, amazing.
I can't remember when he joined. 2016.
Yeah,
I want to say.
Yeah, from open source collaborator to author,
Yeah.
peer.
Yeah, and Tom joining was great because I then had another person who really understood the code very well to sort of bounce ideas off of and review everything. It wasn't until Tom joined that people really started reviewing the code that I had written, which is weird because Google demands code reviews for everything, but because it was on GitHub, I kind of had my own little kingdom to work in.
Oh,
no one was reviewing anything. Yes, that's
so,
right.
Yeah, so then I guess maybe for those watching this now or in posterity, do you want to talk a little bit about why Santa? Like where did the need for this tool arise from, and what your initial scope was?
So the need came from our security teams. The MacOps team at Google, at least at the time, most of our job was making sure the security teams, of which there were like 3, were happy. They would come to us constantly with like demands to make things more secure. We had a binary authorization system for Windows. We were using Bit9, which was deployed in a hurry because of an incident that happened in 2009. And I'm not sure how much of that I'm allowed to talk about. There are details on the internet about it, but I don't want to get into trouble, so I'm not going to mention anymore. And there had been a big push from Windows to Mac because of that incident. And security were very happy with Mac OS compared to Windows, but then they were like, well, now the attackers are just moving over, and we need that tool on Mac OS. And it didn't exist. There weren't as many companies doing it. Security software at the time was generally not as widely available for Mac OS. And Bit9 was essentially working on a Mac version, but it was not ready yet. We had as a team, we generally had the principle of, if we can build it ourselves instead of buying it, let's do that, because it makes our lives much easier when we have full control over everything.
Interesting. Have you found that ethos has persisted?
I think for the MacOps team, it generally has. I think security generally would prefer to buy things because then you do get a team behind it. You do have researchers who are working on those things. People looking for new types of attacks that they can write protections for. But as Mac admins, I think we generally prefer to write our own tools so that we're not beholden to a vendor when a new version of Mac OS comes out and the tool breaks.
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating. I've seen this in multiple places, the same kind of discussion about the trade-offs of open source, custom tools. And we had a guest, Kat Self, on here 2 months ago, and we were talking a bit about the security debate about open source software. And I think especially when you're talking about filling a niche that there isn't a vendor for, I think that happens often with enterprise Mac admin, that there just isn't an option, or at least not one that works in the way that you need.
And sometime around the same period of time, again, my memory's fuzzy, it's been so long now, one of the security researchers at Google found the antivirus software we were using at the time had a horrible security hole in it. So we very quickly had to remove that as well. So then Santa became the only thing we had protecting our machines, which caused it to expand in scope. We went from just doing binary allow listing to we also added lots of logging. It is now a very rich source of logs for the security teams to analyze. And we've been adding lots of features since then.
Interesting. And so that journey from binary allow listing to full security tooling, was that something that did you get some headcount to help you with that? Were you just on your own to scale it up?
Nope.
Wow.
It was until Tom joined, it was all on me. The rest of the MacOps team had other things to do. Like we still had all the other work we'd been doing before Santa existed. I still had other work to do. I wasn't working on it full time. It has never been anything more than at most a 50% project. There have been, occasions when I might have worked on it for 2 weeks straight and not done anything else, but then I would immediately go back to doing everything else. Tom joining definitely helped. That made my life much easier. But no.
On the I noticed there's some questions here in the chat. So did Bit9 ever finish their Mac version?
I honestly have no idea. Once I had my proof of concept working and realized that I could finish this, I stopped caring. The security teams were dubious at first whether I would be able to get this finished and deployed, which I took as a personal challenge. So yeah, I stopped paying attention.
As far as I know, Bit9 got acquired by Carbon Black. And Carbon Black, I think they had not one, but more than one security products for the Mac, and one that somehow runs on the Mac and can do deny listing, but the allow listing, I think it falls quite short on that. So, but I don't know the details. I'm a bit curious. The first sync server that I heard of was called North Pole by some, I think, guys from the Netherlands. Have you ever come across that?
I remember seeing that.
Yeah.
They did send a pull request fairly early on.
Yeah.
I don't remember what for. I don't know if that project still exists.
No,
I haven't seen anything about it for a long time.
I mean, for us with Central, this was a trigger. Okay, there's this little project, but no, it's not getting any further, any whatever code that gets added. And then while we were working on doing a OS query server, we just thought, okay, that's good. Santa is quite similar with the TLS component, and that's how we put both together into Central back then.
Interesting.
I think curious to hear a little bit more about the Central Santa sync server integration, and how that came about.
Should I share?
Sure.
I mean, I think that's while we were working on I mean, OS Query was just a fantastic new tooling, and then I got aware that Santa is quite similar, as shared already. And then Eric, who's the friend I started Central with, he's mainly responsible for the code, and he was just like, okay, yeah, let's work on that. And then we reached out to a few people just to get early feedback, and was like, yeah, sounds good. So, and this is how Central started. Just people had their MDM like Jamf already, so, and we needed to have those agents somehow do their job, and how to get this connected with the existing management systems, and this required an additional server, and this server became Central. So very simple story.
Yeah.
I was quite impressed that Zentral and Morose and North Pole, wrote sync servers without us having any documentation on what the protocol looked like. We didn't have any real documentation to begin with. I'm not a tech writer. People writing documentation deserve a lot of respect. It's hard, and I'm not very good at it. So a bunch of people went and reverse engineered. They went and looked at the code and figured out, well, this is what it's expecting here, and wrote their own versions and did a great job. We do now have documentation on how to write a sync server. I still don't think it's great, but it exists at least, which is better than what we had before. Documentation in general is an issue that we need to get a little bit better at.
I'm curious if there's the architectural decisions that you would go through. Do you hear people kind of debating like the merits of managing Santa with or without a sync server? Like, for example, using Santa control locally.
I don't know if people have debates about it. I think whatever works for a company or an individual works for them. We wrote it with a sync server in mind. We had upvote in mind pretty early on. That was the only way it was ever going to work at our scale. But if you've got 100 machines, you could manage them with Santa CTL. You could manage them with static rules now, which is a feature that took me an embarrassingly long time to add, but it does now exist. You can now add rules directly in the MDM config. I don't have a strong opinion about the right way to do things. It's different for every company. And like my only experience is with giant organizations like Google with, far too many machines to manage like that. So I'm not here to prescribe to how somebody else should do it. Do what's right for you.
Yeah.
And
sense.
if what we have isn't right for you, let us know so we can try and help.
Yeah, not to put Mac on the spot, but I know he and I work together, and this has been a topic we've been looking at lately with managing, since we manage devices with Salt. Mac's been writing a Salt module for managing Santa.
Yeah, we just deployed our first draft, essentially, of a Salt state to manage Santa locally. And I just want to say big thanks for that clean flag that was added somewhat recently, because it made my life far, far better. That's a flag that when you run Santa control with the rule command to import a rule from a JSON file, clean will dump all the existing rules and replace them with whatever you're importing, which makes stateful management way easier.
That was all Pete. Thanks to Pete.
Big ups to Pete.
So here's a question. So for organizations that don't have dedicated engineers like you and Tom, how much of a lift is it for an admin to implement Santa? And when those practitioners move on to something else, how hard is it, do you think, for someone else to pick it up and maintain?
That's a good question. As far as getting it deployed and running, I think getting it deployed is somewhat difficult. You have to take time to implement and get your rule sets so that you cover the most frequently used applications on your fleet. We do have some documentation on our sort of recommended flow for doing that, where you run all the clients in monitor mode for a while, and you collect events, and then you start allow listing things that you're okay with, talking to users who are running things that you're probably not okay with them running, and then figuring out groups of machines that you can start to put into lockdown mode once you've allow listed the things that they will not complain about not working. And how you do that, again, depends on the size of your company and how you're going to do it. Like if you've got a sync server you're going to use, how you manage that and how difficult that is to do depends on which one you picked. I don't have much experience with any of them. I've never run Zentral. I've never run Morose. I know they exist. They're all good projects. We document some of them on our README. We're happy to point people at them, but like I don't get to run them because we already have one. I just point people at their docs and say, bug them, not me. And again, how hard is it for someone else to pick that up if the people who implement it leave? Depends on how well they documented it and which route they went. Like if you implement static rules in an MDM profile, for instance, you've just got a few chunks of rules listing which rules they are. Those are often hard to understand. So our config that has a couple of those rules in have some comments in that say, this rule is this and it's for this reason. But if you don't do that and then you leave, the next admin who picks up after you is not going to know what those rules are for. And it's going to be very confused. And I think a general answer to that question of how hard is it to get it running is our docs need to get better at making that onboarding flow easier. If you have suggestions, please let us know. Please open GitHub issues.
Oh yeah, I've noticed in the chat there's this link, radiotope.com, Santa client troubleshooting resource. I haven't seen this, but this is I love the style of it. I don't know. Have you seen this, Russell?
I had not seen this one.
Yeah.
There have been 2 or 3 different sort of blog posts describing various things with Santa. My only complaint with blogs is that they get outdated. The output will look different, or recommendations might not stay up to date as we add things. Like for a company that doesn't want to run a sync server, 5 years ago, the answer would have been to do it with SantaCTL and manually add rules. Now I would probably suggest using static rules in your MDM profile, depending on how many you have. Just because you don't have to worry about that. Like we take care of receiving updates to the profile and applying those rules. But they're filling a need that we are not, so I can't complain too much.
Yeah, makes sense. That's the benefit of open source communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that the logging from Santa is like become a great resource for corporate security. How are you, or what do you recommend as far as like ingesting those logs? Like, are you streaming those to like a central alerting pipeline, or?
Yeah, this is one of those long time sort of pain points for us. Is we have tools for that. All of our Macs are collecting various logs and uploading them to a central pipeline, which then does analysis and alerting and monitoring and retention. That none of that is open, and I can't point anybody at it. I'm just like, here's the logs.
Yeah.
Go find another tool to pull those in, Splunk or something. And because I live in the Google world, I don't know about most of those things, unfortunately. Like I'm aware Splunk exists and Datadog. And more than that, I don't really know, because we have our own things. We have a bit of a tech island thing going on where we live in our own little bubble. And that's difficult with open source, because then people come to me and they say, well, what do you recommend for this? Like, I have no idea. I'm sorry.
Hiring a team of data scientists to build a pipeline.
Yeah.
I think the volume of the events is quite enormous, right? So
yeah,
that's
we very quickly,
that makes it tricky.
For us, we very quickly exceeded our ingest limits when we first turned on Santa logging. It's kind of amazing.
And yet our security teams are constantly asking for more. Like we have fork and exit logging turned on, which is a huge amount of data, and I don't understand how they can possibly make use of all of it. But they do, and they want it turned on. It's off by default because most other people don't want that, and that would balloon your logs even more.
Amazing. So I guess you mentioned resourcing a couple of times, and the fact that this is very much your baby. And is there any? So you mentioned documentation specifically. That's something that you want to work on. But is there any other thing kind of on the roadmap or in the back of your mind that, if resources weren't a factor or constraint, you would focus on?
Documentation is at the top of my mind at the moment. I actually opened an issue this morning to make a sort of wizard to guide you through the configuration, which I've started working on, like a little web UI where you tick boxes instead of having to read the docs and figure out how to turn that into a big pile of XML. Things like that would be very nice to have. I don't have any. There's a couple of bugs we're currently working on fixing, which are very interesting. They're sort of very, very, very long tail bugs that we see very rarely, but they're more interesting to fix because of that. A long-standing thing that I would love to work on, but I've just never found the time for, is a sort of standalone mode. Like if you have your own machine, it's not your work machine, and you just wanted to keep it secure, is there a way that we could make Santa suitable for that? When we first talked about this, we described it as like Little Snitch, but for binaries. Like I would love a UI like
Little Elf. Little Elf.
Yeah.
Extend the metaphor even further.
Santa's little helper.
So yeah, that's the thing we've talked about for many years. Various people have talked about it and come up with ideas for how we could make it work, but it's one of those things that would take a great deal of effort, and we just haven't had time. And it's hard to justify doing because it's not something that we would ever use internally.
I've thought many a time about how to implement Santa for my parents, just to help keep their Mac a little tidier.
Yeah, that's always the example people use is I want to put it on my grandmother's machine, my grandfather's machine.
Yeah,
Okay. I get that.
I think
I was impressed by what Matt and Pete shared, Objective by the Sea, just on the when a release is cut on GitHub, that it's tested within Google for a very great number already. So before it's even considered release. So can you just share a little bit on that again to the audience?
Yeah. So whenever a pull request is merged on GitHub, there's an automated system imports that into Google's internal source repository, and then periodically we'll start a build. It's constantly tested in the background, but we don't build it triggered manually because we like to have control over what version numbers we have and things like that. And then once a release is started, we create candidates for it constantly until we've decided that that's enough. We've got enough features in for this month's release. And then we have various tracks. We have super unstable, which is just the people working on Santa. Unstable is us and MacOps, pretty much. Testing is a lot of people who have signed up to be guinea pigs, to be experimented on, and they don't mind their machines breaking. There's about 1,000 people in that group. And from there, we then deploy to percentages of stable. I think 1, 5, 10, 20, 50, and 75 and 100, I think are the numbers. And we don't publish a release to GitHub until we've hit 50% of stable. So by that point, it's been installed on about 70,000 machines-ish. And we have crash boards monitoring for, is the client crashing? Have we seen a drop off in the number of machines syncing on a regular basis? Has CPU usage or memory usage gone up as an average across all those machines? So by the time it gets to GitHub, we're pretty confident that the release is good. It still doesn't stop us from occasionally shipping bugs, particularly in features that we don't use or other people use differently to the way we do. But it gives us quite a lot of confidence that at least the core works.
Impressive numbers for QA. I mean, other security vendors, I don't know, are far away from that. But they have customers, right?
Yeah, that's the thing is that they would be testing on customers. We're testing on other Google employees.
Employees
don't really have a choice. Yeah.
Did those testers get anything in exchange for their testing? Do they get
they get a badge?
A badge.
Yeah, we have our internal employee directory. You can collect badges for various things, and despite it having absolutely no value whatsoever, people collect these and are very particular about them. I have hundreds. I don't know why.
It's fun
Santa,
collecting them. What's the Santa badge? I think we want to see this.
Honestly, I can't remember. I think it is just a little picture of Santa's face. But they also get a badge for just generally being a tester, because they don't just test Santa, they test everything that MacOps deploys to testing. So there's lots of stuff that could get broken, not just Santa.
You mentioned the sort of system resource monitors that you're looking at. Do you find that or can you think of any instances where system performance was a flag for a release that you sort of had to debug or pull back?
Oh yeah, that has happened several times. Performance is definitely a feature. It's something that we spend a lot of time optimizing. I mean, I remember early on when we were writing Santa, one of my sort of benchmarks for whether it was okay or not was doing a full build of Chrome, which at that point in 2014 took about 45 minutes on my Mac from a clean checkout. And I would I would do several clean builds in a row, and then I would install Santa and do several more clean builds in a row. And I wasn't allowed to lose. It wasn't allowed to take more than 5% longer.
Mm.
And I think we've generally kept that under 2% in reality.
Is that something that you run as like part of the CI? Like, do you have like an automated process for that, or are you sort of just relying on the metrics coming in from like engineering systems?
At this point, it's just the metrics. We don't have a good way of deploying a build to a machine and running a cron test. We probably could figure that out. There are ways to do those things. We just haven't bothered.
Well, yeah, I mean, those numbers are very impressive, because I mean, we definitely see other security tools that we're deploying impact, engineer build times pretty significantly, much more than 2%. So that's definitely it's an aspirational number.
And I think that's, I don't know, I think that's maybe one of the reasons that was a thing, is that these systems are normally written by developers or sort of security people and then given to MacAdmins and said, here, go and deploy this. And then the MacAdmins are the ones that hear the complaints from the users, go, oh, my machine's slow. Well, when I started working on this, I was the one that would be facing all of those complaints. I didn't want people complaining to me. So it was in my best interest to make it performant, so I didn't get people yelling at me.
Yeah, you're held accountable by direct contact with public scrutiny.
Yep.
Has anyone, okay, I don't know if you've been on the record for this, but has anyone asked you about the name Santa, where that came from?
I get asked that all the time. It's probably the thing I'm most proud of. I can't remember how this came up, but Santa keeps track of who is naughty and who's nice. And at the time that it started, we had separate tables for deny listing and allow listing. Those eventually merged into one, but we had a list for both, and it fit with the rhyme.
Amazing. I think I definitely remember the first time that I put 2 and 2 together. I think it was when I saw the logs and it says, I Santa'd this. And it's like, oh, Santa is a verb.
Yeah. Yeah. Naming is hard. Yes, we did add the explanation of the name on GitHub, because I was disappointed that wasn't, I hadn't made that obvious. And there were lots of people not making that connection. It's not obvious unless someone has explained it to you.
Yeah, and you use it and understand.
Yeah. It does make it hard to Google. I'm sorry. I didn't think of that when I was naming it. It's actually, internally, there is another system at Google called Santa. We have the Santa Tracker, which has existed for longer. I don't think that team was very happy when I deployed this. Because their thing was very fun. It was a very nice thing that would help you, track Santa around the world around Christmas time. And I came along with this security system that everyone's like, oh no, another security thing. So, I see another question in the chat. Newer features of Santa people may not know about. The 2 most interesting new features we've added in the last year or 2. Again, my memory is horrible. We've added lots of new rule types, which makes managing Santa easier. For the longest time, we just had binary and certificate, and that was it. You may do. But we've added now CD hash, which is very similar to a binary rule, except that it's slightly faster because we get that from the framework, so we don't have to compute as much. We get team ID, which is more broad than certificate, but better because you don't have to keep worrying about when those certificates change for a given vendor. And then signing ID, which I think is the most useful, which lets you allow list one application through all of its future versions, assuming that the vendor doesn't decide to change the signing ID partway through its life. But this lets you do something like, say, I want to allow Firefox and not have to worry about when new versions of Firefox get released every 2 weeks. So those are great.
That's great. Were those features that were requested, or ones that you sort of saw a need for internally and added to the product?
I think a combination of both. 1 or 2 were requested, and I think 1 came internally. And some of these have come up because of our switch from a kernel extension to using the endpoint security framework, which made implementing some of these much easier. Nice. Which was, I want to say, around 2019. But we still had to support the Kext for a couple of years people were still using old versions of macOS that didn't have it.
Mm.
So until the kext went away, we were stuck supporting that old version. And as soon as we got rid of the kext, we're like, oh, well, now we have all these new features we can add because we're not bound by what the kext can do.
Mm.
And then another new feature we added, which I think is really important, is file access authorization, which lets you, as well as block applications, you can actually block applications access to specific files. The sort of canonical example we use for this is like your cookie store for your browser. You could basically say the entire Chrome profile directory can only be read or written by Chrome.
Mm.
So if some malware does manage to get running on your machine and tries to read your cookies, Santa will stop it from reading those files.
Mm.
No access to your cookies, which is a great feature. It's quite complex to configure because it's very powerful. It does have documentation. And you have to put your policy for that into a separate file that you reference from your main config because it's so big. Again, feedback on the docs would be very welcome. I don't know if many places are using it yet, but we're using it internally to protect various secrets we have on machines. Security are very happy with it.
Does the rule set support something like regex for kind of generalizing file types or something?
It supports globs and prefixes. Regexes are a bit harder because they're quite costly to compute.
Sure.
But yeah, prefixes and globs. And then for the applications that you allow or deny, you can use any of the other rule types, signing ID, team ID. And you can invert them. So you could basically say everything but this can access a file if you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very cool. Definitely useful for the sort of malware example, I think.
Yeah.
We often hear that from security teams concerned about what might be stored on disk, and I think when you don't have a lot of guarantees that those files won't be read by any process that we're not aware of, then you have to sort of work backwards and say like, okay, no one's allowed to do this.
Yeah, it's a good feature. We're very excited about that one. But again, we're not very good at publicizing the work we do. So quite often people will say, oh, can you add this feature? We're like, oh yeah, we added that like 18 months ago. It's right there. It's in the documentation. I get you didn't read it because it's really long and not very well written, but it's there. Maybe we should have a blog or something. I don't know.
It's like magic, it's a little bit of Santa's magic right there.
Yeah.
Which has already been implemented.
Yeah. We've actually had that happen internally. We've had security people come to us and ask us for features, and we go, yeah, we did that 2 years ago. It's right there. You're already using it. Your other team is using it. Like, oh, cool. And then they leave us alone.
So here's a bit of a loaded question. Have you, we're talking about this sort of build versus buy conversation that's like a perennial debate. Is this something that you have faced as Santa's developed internally? Has there been any kind of pressure applied to say like, why are we still using this tool? Or is there a competing solution that you felt like you had to advocate for?
Not really. If there has been discussion about replacing Santa with something else, it has not reached me. We did have a thing at one point where we have a vendor with another security product on our machines. I don't think I'm allowed to say which one. And security teams wanted us to implement, they wanted the machines to have the ability to block USB mounts, for data exfiltration. And the vendors who supplies this product said they were going to do it and they were going to charge lots of money for it. We were like, well, hang on a minute, we could do that. So we added that feature and did it faster. And then went back to them and said, well, we've done it. I'm like, oh, we were just about to pay for it. Could you not have let us know sooner? Like, we just wrote it, leave us alone. So that is now being used. I don't know whether that made the vendor unhappy or not. That's not within my remit.
So rather the opposite of what I was describing, more like you're finding inspiration from commercial tools.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't have to justify it. I don't know if those discussions happen. They may happen above my pay grade or in other groups. But I have heard no rumblings of us thinking of getting rid of it. It reduces, the numbers that I have seen of it reducing our incidence of malware infections is so much that I think it would be very hard for someone to try and justify trying to get rid of it. We have numbers from how often we used to have to re-image machines because of infections, and those numbers are now tiny.
Oh, amazing.
It's gone from hundreds a year to like less than 10.
What was the process for, identifying and then re-imaging machines? Was that something that people would sort of self-report, or?
It was occasionally self-reporting, but it was mostly from execution logs. Like we would see things happening on a machine and go, we know that is a piece of malware that definitely should not be executing.
Mm-hmm.
Or we see a pattern in the logs of certain accesses of files and things, and security would know immediately, like, we know which piece of malware that is. We've analyzed it already.
Oh, amazing. And so, just go straight into rules, Santa rules, and
yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not privy to how those things happen. It's a different group.
Yeah. Amazing. Let me see if we have any questions in the Slack. Oh yeah, definitely some +1s on the home version, Santa home version.
If anybody would like to contribute that, I'd be very happy to mentor somebody through the process. We do have starter projects on the GitHub issues as well, if somebody would like to contribute and doesn't know where to start.
Oh, so what do you mean by starter projects?
Issues that are not super high priority for us, but we think they wouldn't be too difficult for somebody who's not familiar with the project to sort of tackle. And we'd be happy to talk somebody through like how they might go about it and what we're looking for. We occasionally get issues get open. We're like, well, probably not going to get to this anytime soon, but we'll mark it as a starter project because it's not that hard.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way to try and encourage more pull requests. It hasn't really worked.
Do you have any conference talks or anything coming up that you can shout out?
I do not. I don't know of any that anybody on the Santa team is doing in the near future. Actually, I haven't been to a conference for quite a long time. I was scheduled to give a brief talk at Objective by the Sea in early 2020, and I cancelled my trip to Hawaii because I was like, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get home. And I wasn't sure whether I was making the right choice at the time. It was still in that period where we're like, is this a real thing or is it not a real thing?
Oh yeah, it was going to be over by September. I think we all thought at that point.
So I would have been stuck. I don't know if that's the right word, but I would have been stuck in Hawaii for quite a long time if I had gone.
Oh, terrible! That would have been
a terrible thing. Yeah.
Well, I'll open that question up to anyone else on the call. Does anyone have any upcoming conferences that they're
next week in the UK? There's MacAd UK happening, and then I think MDO YVR is next, and then PSU, right? So Mac, you're going MDO YVR, right?
Yep, I will be at YVR. I'm down here in Seattle, so it's a nice quick jog up the coast.
Nice. And Henry, are you presenting at in the UK?
Yeah, next week on some IDP and MDM connectivity and some workflows. And then I go also to MDO YVR. So pretty happy to do that.
Nice.
So Matt and I have a beer.
Great. I think oh yeah, nice, Mac. You listed to the link to the starter projects. Cool. Yeah, that's a good thing to shout out for anyone who wants to get their feet wet. Well, cool. I guess I'll wrap things up here unless anyone has any other questions. But yeah, Russell, thanks so much for coming and like helping us understand more of the history and where things are.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Cool. I'll end the stream here, but see you guys next time.
Bye-bye. See you. Bye.